Hello, everybody. My name is Laree Talbert, and I'm a person in law. Hello, can y'all hear me? Hello. Yeah, what you call it, everybody? Yeah, okay. All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Laree Talbert, and I'm a person in long-term recovery. What that means to me is that I have not found it necessary to use any drugs or alcohol in almost 11 years. And I feel like, well, I know that recovery has changed my life for the better. I'm a better sister. I'm a, I'm just better all around. And I speak out about recovery because it has changed my life for the better, and I want others to have the same. I want others to have the same support that I had and know that recovery is possible. I'm going to unmute everyone because we're still waiting on George to come in. Come into the hello, Al. Can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me, Larry?
Yes. I was just going to give it. I was just going to do a quick check-in until our presenter gets here. Is anybody? Oh yes. Also, I got to do the housekeeping too. I got to tell y'all that this webinar is worth 1.5 CEU. Oh, I'm gonna have to turn whoever that is. This webinar is worth 1.5 CEUs. We do not send certificates for webinars. You will receive an email approximately a day after the webinar thanking you for your attendance. Please keep that for your records, and we will send out an email in November asking you to turn in your CEUs for the year, okay? Let's see, does anybody want to do a check-in? Because we're still waiting on the presenter. Raise your hand if you want to do a check-in, please. All right, Dan, you are unmuted.
Hey, Larry, this is Dan Walden. How you doing?
Hi, how you doing? You can
Doing
do your,
great.
yeah, you can tell me what's right with you today.
Oh, what's right with me today is I'm sitting here next to my sweet dog. I had a great, very productive day helping build sets at the local community theater, and I'm ready to learn more ways to fight bias.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you. Anybody else want to tell me what's right with them? Raise your hand, please. I guess not. I guess we'll just wait on George. Give you a few minutes. Jody, I see you. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. What's right with you, Jody?
What's right with me is I got my little girl sitting in my lap. She'll be 9 months old tomorrow,
All
and
right.
just happy to be home with her.
All right. Thank you. Is it? I just saw a name. Hold 1 second. Al, go ahead.
Hey, what's right with me is I started my job as a peer at UAB Medical Center on Tuesday.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
I am very excited.
I'm excited for you. Where?
UAB's in Birmingham,
Okay.
and it's the 19th biggest hospital in the country, and they have just hired 4 peers, and
Wow.
it's a great start to their program.
Okay. Well, congratulations. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
sharing that.
You're welcome.
All right, Ponce Ramsey, you are unmuted. You have to unmute yourself.
Oh,
All right,
good
I'm back.
afternoon, everyone.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm good. We good. How you doing?
Oh, well, just got off of work.
That's what's right with you today? You well?
Yes, ma'am. I work today.
All right. Well,
I'm a
thank
HIV tester.
you're what?
I'm a HIV tester.
Okay. You live here in Atlanta or where you live?
I live in Atlanta.
Okay. What's the name of the program you work for?
Anise Incorporated.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. I know Mr. Jordan just came through. Okay, awesome. I think George has gotten here, everybody. I appreciate y'all working with me and being patient with us. Thank you so much. I'm gonna turn it over to George, who
Thank
is
you.
our presenter today. There you go. Oh, I'm sorry, George. I didn't even tell him what the webinar was on. It must be 50 ways to address gender bias in the workplace. There you go, George.
That's quite all right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the CARES Academy webinar for the month of September. It's a pleasure to be with you. And thank you, Loree, for setting this up. I look forward to having some informative conversations as we really do talk about gender bias and how it occurs in the workplace. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's get ready to rumble! So, I want to just spend a second talking about how you participate in the webinar today. So on your screen, you should see a control panel similar to what you see here on this screen. And notice there's a orange rectangle that has a white box in it. Or actually an orange rectangle that's got a white arrow in it. Click on that arrow, it will minimize your control panel. If you click back on that white box, your control panel will come back. Best practice is to go ahead and check auto hide the control panel, and that way when you're not using it, it goes away. So eliminate background noise, if you would, by muting your phone or your computer microphone, and then unmute when you are called on to talk. And we want this to really be an interactive webinar. So best practice, again, is to use your telephone, but be sure to enter your PIN, not the PIN that's shown here, but if you click on Use Telephone, you'll see the audio PIN that you should enter. So ask a question one or two ways. The first way is just type a question into the comment box, and Loree will be able to see that. And the second special way is raise your hand. I don't mean stick your hand up in the air, but you have a little hand icon, and that lets Loree know that you'd like to make a comment or ask a question. And at that point, she can unmute you, and we can have a conversation. So there is a handout that is available. If you'll look down in the handout section of your control panel, you'll see a PDF that contains the slides, at least the beginning slides of the presentation today. And there is a participant feedback form that I think that is something you'll receive as part of the GoToWebinar. And just so you know, this is being recorded. So what we'd like to do today is for you to be able to recognize 5 different kinds of bias and what's the impact of multiple bias, because it's not the case that we only have one, but this is what is contemporarily referred to as intersectionality. And then list 5 common workplace scenarios and where bias can appear, and be informed about what you can do in the moment when bias occurs. So this is a program that is actually put together by an organization called Lean In. And this is a nonprofit that helps women focus specifically on their ambitions and to create an equitable world. And there's some significant partners that you can see here on the screen. This organization was actually founded by Sheryl Sandberg, who is she is Mark Zuckerberg's second in command at Facebook. So why we're here, frankly, gender bias, whether it's deliberate or unconscious, is holding women back in the workplace. And this bias makes it harder for women to get hired and promoted, and their everyday work experiences tended to be negatively impacted by gender bias. This makes it more difficult for companies to actually level the playing field, which certainly holds women back. So today we're going to talk about some concrete steps to take to address gender bias head on. So the agenda will set the tone, do some poll questions, learn about gender bias, watch a short video. It's about 15, 16 minutes long, and then dive into some specific situations and solutions. And that's where I'm going to call on you to participate by reading what's on the screen and talking about what you understand from what's on the screen. And then we'll finish with a closing activity. So setting the tone. First of all, it's important to acknowledge that bias is not limited to just gender. We have multiple biases that relate to all sorts of variables related to who's like us and who's not like us. And we spent a day in the CARES Academy talking more extensively about this. But the point is, we all have biases, and those biases cause us to do things that we maybe consciously know we're doing, but in many cases we're not even aware of. So just knowing that the bias exists isn't enough. We have to commit to take some action to correct bias when we see it both in ourselves as well in other people. So the key here is if you tell stories during the webinar, these stories should be anonymous. So it's not about coming on and telling who your boss is or who your company is and talking about all the problems with gender bias that occurs there, but rather tell the story with the main characters being anonymous and give people the benefit of the doubt. There's nobody on the planet who is bias free. So this is about us learning how do we accommodate the fact that biases happen, and how can we support one another to really begin to address those in an effective way. So Loree, if you'd like, go ahead and launch the first poll question.
Okay. Let's see. The first question is, yes, there you go. In a study of performance reviews, men who stayed late to help prepare for a meeting got a 14% increase in their rating. What did the women get who helped to stay late?
Yeah.
And that is 0%, 8%, 14, or 20. Can y'all please vote? Can we please have 100% participation? Right now, we only have 33. It's going up 40, 50. Come on, guys. It's only four responses.
And this is completely anonymous. We won't know who answered in what way, so take your best guess.
Right. I'll give you about 5 more seconds, okay? We got 76%. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close it. So the 38% of us think 0%. Another 38 thinks 8% get an increase. Well, get 8% increase. 13% think a 14% increase, and 13% of us think they get a 20% increase.
Okay, so it's pretty evenly divided.
Yeah.
On the lower end of the scale.
Yep. 0
the
and 8.
research shows that, in fact, the correct answer is women get no increase at all. And in fact, when men help out with office tasks, they're often rewarded with raises and bonuses and those kinds of things, but women are not. And in fact, women get penalized if they refuse to do those extra duty work tasks.
Wow.
So,
Thank you, George.
yeah, it's kind of remarkable that we have that particular bias. So let's do the second poll question. So what percent of black women have never had an informal interaction with the senior leader at their company?
Oh, I'm sorry. There you go. Is it 19%, 39%, 59%, or 79? I got 68% voted. I'm gonna go up a little bit more, guys. 5 more
Wow,
sections. Yeah, it's doing pretty good.
y'all are getting good at this.
Yeah. All right, I'm gonna close. And 18% think that 19% of black women has never. 29% of us picked 59%. 53 of us picked 79. No one picked 39%.
Interesting.
Yeah. So
So again, the research shows that about 6 out of 10 black women have never had an informal interaction with a senior leader at their company. So this kind of gets to the point that having not just formal interactions where you're invited to meetings is important, but just opportunities to be with leaders and for them to learn who you are and for you to learn who they are. There's a bias in the fact that we tend to invite people who are like us to those sorts of informal interactions.
wow.
So we'll talk a little
George, we
more
have a
about that.
question. I'm sorry.
Okay, good.
We have a
That's
question.
okay.
John Page, you are unmuted. You have to let me see. There you go. John Page, you're self-muted. Unmute yourself and you can speak.
Hey, John.
I don't know, maybe
Hey,
that was
John.
he's still muted. You're still muted. All right. I guess we'll just come back to George.
Yeah.
All right.
So what are the common biases that women experience at work? Let's just run through this video, and this is each of the descriptions of these biases is what you're going to find contained in the handout.
We all have unconscious biases. Our brains take in more information than they can process, so we rely on mental shortcuts to simplify the world around us, which means we rely on stereotypes. And let me be clear, we all do this. Sometimes those mental shortcuts are helpful. If an animal is running towards you in the woods, you don't stop to think whether or not it's a bear before you decide what to do. You make a snap judgment. But relying on snap judgments about people can be very harmful. Experts at Harvard developed what's called the IAT, or the Implicit Association Test, to better understand the biases we commonly hold. The results are eye-opening. 76% of participants more readily associate men with career and women with family, regardless of their own gender. And 75% of participants show a preference for white people over black people. And this is even true for half of black participants. Let those numbers sink in for a moment. It's hard to admit our biases. We don't want to see ourselves falling into these traps. But no one is immune from bias, which means we all have work to do. This video series will help you understand the common biases women face. But research shows that awareness is not enough. We need to internalize that gender biases are harmful and learn how to counteract them in real life. From challenging yourself to slow down and make more measured decisions, to speaking up when you see biased behavior in others. We need to commit to be part of the solution. It's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. Employees on diverse teams are more committed and work harder. And companies with more women in leadership have more generous employee policies and produce better business results. We all benefit when we tap everyone's talents and ideas, and we all rise when women rise.
Performance bias is based on deep-rooted assumptions about women's and men's abilities. We tend to underestimate women's performance and overestimate men's performance. As a result, women often have to accomplish more to show they're equally as competent as men. This is why studies show women are often hired based on past accomplishments. We need to see proof they have the right skills. And men are often hired based on future potential. We already assume they have the skills they need. To understand the impact of performance bias, consider what happens when you remove gender from decision making. When 10 major U.S. orchestras use blind auditions, the odds of women making it past the first round improved by 50%. And replacing a woman's name with a man's name on a resume improves the odds of getting hired, and study after study shows the same time. Performance bias can have a big impact during hiring and performance reviews. It is even more pronounced when the criteria for reviews are unclear, which leaves room for individuals to rely on gut feelings and personal inferences, which of course means bias is more likely to influence their decisions. In one study, resumes for candidates for police chief were written, so one version was heavy on street smarts, and the other was heavy on school smarts. When people were asked to define the hiring criteria for the job in advance, so before seeing the resumes, there was no bias against female candidates. But when they saw the resumes first, they ended up favoring whatever type of experience the male candidate had. So they valued street smarts, the male candidate had street smarts, and school smarts when the male candidate had school smarts. In other words, evaluators shifted the criteria around, so what ended up mattering was whatever experience the male candidate had. Performance bias often leads to missed opportunities and lower performance ratings for women, and both can have a huge impact on women's career progression.
Attribution bias is closely linked to performance bias. Because we tend to think women are less competent, we are less likely to give them credit for their accomplishments, and we are more likely to blame them for mistakes. Even when women and men work on tasks together, women often get less credit for success and more blame for failure. We also fall into the trap of thinking women's contributions are less valuable than men's. One place this happens is when women are talked. Women are more likely to be talked over and interrupted in meetings. In one study, men interrupted women nearly 3 times as often as they interrupted other men. And women were also far more likely to interrupt other women, but they rarely interrupted men. Perhaps not surprisingly, because women are held to higher standards and they receive less credit and wield less influence, their confidence often erodes. For example, when it comes to performance, women predict they'll do worse than they actually do. In contrast, men predict they'll do better than they actually do. Women are also less likely to think they're ready for promotion than men. And men typically apply for jobs when they meet 60% of hiring criteria, while women wait until they meet 100%. However, it may not just be lack of confidence holding women back. Because we hold women to higher standards than men, women may rightfully feel like they have to hit a higher bar. Women face what's called likability bias, also known as the likability penalty. They often face a social penalty when they assert themselves that men don't. This is rooted in age-old expectations of women and men. We expect men to be assertive, so when they take the lead, it feels natural to us. In contrast, we expect women to be kind and communal, so when they assert themselves, we often react unfavorably. We like them less. The likability bias surfaces in the way we describe women. Women are more likely to be described as intimidating, too aggressive, or bossy, words rarely used to describe men in the workplace. And you may have caught yourself having a negative response to a woman who has a strong leadership style or speaks directly. Being well-liked really matters. Ask yourself, who are you more likely to support and promote? The men with high marks across the board, or the woman who has equally high marks but is not as well-liked? To make things more complicated, women also pay a penalty for being likable. When women are seen as agreeable and nice, we often consider them less competent. This double bind makes the workplace challenging for women. They need to assert themselves to be seen as effective. But when they assert themselves, they may be less liked. Men do not walk the same tightrope. Motherhood triggers assumptions that women are less committed to their careers and less competent. It can intensify the performance bias that women already face. As a result, mothers are often given fewer opportunities and held to higher standards than fathers. We fall into the trap of thinking mothers are not as interested in their jobs now that they have kids, so we assume that they don't want that challenging assignment or to go on that big work trip. Because we think they're less committed, we're more likely to penalise them for small mistakes or oversights. Research shows that maternal bias is the strongest kind of gender bias. In one study, when PTA coordinator is added to a woman's resume, she is 79% less likely to be hired. She's half as likely to be promoted, and she's offered an average of $11,000 less in salary. Interestingly, maternal bias also starts early. As soon as women get engaged, they face pushback because we assume they're going to have children. And men face some pushback when they become parents too. Studies show that fathers who take time off for family reasons receive lower performance ratings and experience steeper reductions in future earnings than mothers who do. Affinity bias is what it sounds like. We gravitate towards people who are like ourselves, people who are similar in appearance, beliefs, and background. And we tend to avoid and even dislike people who are different from us. Affinity bias plays out in several ways in the workplace. In studies, mentors say they're attracted to protégés who remind them of themselves. Hiring managers are more likely to spend time interviewing people who are like them and less time getting to know people who are different. Not surprisingly, they are more likely to give people like them a favorable evaluation. Because white men hold more positions of power and are more likely to gravitate towards other white men, affinity bias has a particularly negative effect on women and people of color. They can end up getting overlooked or left out.
Women of color face biases for being women and biases for being people of color. And LGBTQ women face biases for being women and biases for being LGBTQ. This compounded discrimination can be significantly greater than the sum of its parts. Women of color are particularly underrepresented in the corporate pipeline, behind white men, men of color, and white women. Compared to white women, women of color receive less support from managers, get less access to senior leaders, and are promoted more slowly. And Black women are particularly disadvantaged. This same dynamic holds true for LGBTQ women. Research shows that lesbians have a harder time securing employment than women more broadly. According to one study, when a woman has something on her resume that indicates she's LGBTQ, for example, volunteering for an advocacy group, she's far less likely to get a call back. Many women experience even more biases and types of discrimination. Imagine the compounding effect of being Asian, LGBTQ, and a woman. Or of being Black, Muslim, an immigrant, and a woman. Not surprisingly, research shows that people with 3 or more minority identities can feel like they don't belong anywhere. It's important to note that men can also be held back by bias against their race, sexual identity, religious beliefs, age, or background. You'll see examples of double discrimination in our bias cards. The important thing is that we're all aware of the different biases people face, and we all commit to fairness and equality for everyone.
All right.
All right. George, Benjamin Young has a question.
Hey, Benjamin.
Benjamin, you are unmuted. Let's see what happened to him. Ben, you're unmuted. You can talk. I don't know there, George.
Uh-oh.
Maybe he'll chime in a minute. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, so part of the challenge with this, obviously, is bias is something that we learn, and it gets reinforced in our culture. So I'm trying to get back to my other screen. My computer's not playing. My computer's just not playing well. So main takeaways. What did you get out of that video?
Do you want them to raise their hand?
Yes, if you don't mind.
All right. All right, I got Susan Morley. All right, you are unmuted.
Hi, the thing I was thinking about is when I like to talk to people because I like them. So now I'm thinking, so now am I going to check, am I being biased just because I like them? And I don't mean just in a minimizing way. I mean, this is new. I mean, I guess birds of a feather might come into mind, but I'm thinking about it a lot. There are people that I naturally, it's easier to talk to or I'm drawn to, and I've never considered that it's bias. That's it.
So you're surprised that you just kind of naturally bond with some folks, and others it's much more of a challenge.
Yeah, but also I'm wondering how much I should worry if I am attracted to somebody for business or for any reason. Is it because I'm being biased, or is it just sometimes you gel with people? Like being in recovery, once I know someone's in recovery, I just want to sit right next to them, and because I know it's going to be easy. And so anyway, it is something to watch for, and I'm just curious about how I can be gentle with myself and be aware of it without being suspicious all the time that I'm just a biased jerk walking around.
Well, yeah, no doubt you're not a biased jerk. You're just biased. And the part of what we covered in the CARES Academy had to do with people whose recovery pathways are different than ours. And so there's sort of a natural inclination to say, yeah, if you happen to have used the same pathway, we're going to have an easier time getting along and having conversations, and our experiences are going to be more similar than someone whose pathway is different. And just being aware of that. And if it begins to interfere with the quality of our relationship with the other person, that's when you have to kind of start asking yourself, would it perhaps be advantageous for this peer to get a connection with someone else who has more similar experience than I do? But that's not the first place to start that conversation. That's later on when you find out, you get feedback from them, and if things aren't improving, or if you find yourself questioning how much value your relationship has with the person, or vice versa, then you might ask that question of what do we need to change? Hope that's helpful.
All right, I'm gonna, Frida has her hand raised. Do you have time for one more?
Sure. Hey, Frida.
Hey, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to raise my hand.
Okay. Okay.
Well, now you know the button works.
Yes, I do. Hey, Mr. George, how are you?
Hey, I'm well. How are you?
Great. I'm
You're
fine, thank
on you on here now. You might as well make a comment or something.
you. Well, Mr. George is wonderful at what he does.
Oh, so what about the video? What's your main takeaway from it?
Well, I joined late, so I don't know. That's why I don't have anything.
Okay,
Oh,
well that's
all
fine.
right. All right.
Okay.
I'm gonna try Ben one more time. Ben, you're unmuted.
Hey
Thank you.
Ben.
Hey, George, how you doing, Lori?
Hey, how you doing?
I'm great. So listen, I know you said you're going to get there, but is it just human nature? Is this innate, this built in that we automatically do this sort of subconsciously?
Great question. And the answer is, well, we don't really know. So think of it this way. In the non-human animal world, there is the potential bias to congregate with people who are in that animal's family, clan, tribe, whatever description would apply.
Right.
So the idea seems to be that as a function of evolution, genes developed that allowed us to quickly discriminate who we're safe around and who we're not. And when we find ourselves in situations or around others who cause that sort of alarm to go off, there's a series of physiological reactions that are designed to pump us up and get us ready to respond. Now, that causes us to have a tendency to group socially with similar beings. So we hang out with our family, or we hang out with our clan or our tribe, because that's what ensures that more of the people in our tribe will survive. So it's not really survival of the fittest individual. It's about who can live in community, and that's the human term, not the non-human animal term, but who can live in a group of similar others are the ones that are most likely going to survive. Now, you take that and you apply it to humans, and what you'll find is children growing up tend to not have that sort of bias. They don't necessarily, if you watch kids of different races, for example, play together, there's no natural tendency just to play with people who look like me unless they are taught that in their home context or home environment. So the probably the best answer is it's both genetics and environment that contributes to these biases.
But my take is, George, so does this fall in the same category, same parameter as just prejudice? Or are they two different animals on two different levels?
So prejudice tends to be a learned bias that is resistant to change as a function of being required to have that prejudice to be part of a group.
Okay.
So let's just say everybody is a square, whatever that attribute actually consists of. Well, if you are going to hang out with squares, you got to maintain your squareness. If you suddenly decide one day I'm going to be a triangle or a circle, the folks that are squares are going to look at you kind of weird, and you may find yourself being pushed out of the square group.
Okay.
And so that's how identity plays into this, because those characteristics that we learn about ourselves can certainly influence who we choose to hang around with and who we have an affinity for. But that is probably more learned than genetic, but there's still that genetic basis that kind of underlies all of this.
Okay, I can live with that.
Nice. Good question.
Do you have time for more questions, or do you need to go on?
Yeah, we can do another one.
Okay. Miranda Towns, you are unmuted.
Yes, I have an experience that I experienced. I moved recently to a different area, and it placed me in an atmosphere of people who are not my color.
Mm-hmm.
And for some reason, I became scared to approach them. I was sort of scared to talk to them, and I had to process that with someone, and they brought to my attention that I was the one that was prejudiced. So what they suggested that I do was that I simply step up, let them know who I am and that I'm new to the area, and invite them into my life so that I would get to know them. But for some reason, I had automatically assumed that they didn't like me, that I didn't fit in. And I really feel like a lot of bias that we have, number one, we don't realize it until we get in a situation. And number two, sometimes it's there for no apparent reason at all. Because now I found out that these people love, protect, and promote me more than my own color.
Nice. So you were really able to see your own bias at play there, and as a result of recognizing it, found yourself being accepted by a group that you didn't really expect to be accepted by.
Yes, and I had to move into action quickly, because if I didn't move into action, I probably wouldn't participate in my job.
Nice. It really benefited you to do that. Good.
Yeah, that's all I have.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. George, somebody wants to know, how can they identify their own fears or prejudices or biases?
Well, first of all, pay attention to who gets your attention, and is that attention, does it have a positive valence, a positive emotion attached to it, or a negative emotion attached to it? So part of the challenge is there's so much going on in the world. We can't pay attention to everything. And so we limit what gets through our senses that we pay attention to. Now, biology plays a role in that as well. But so bias influences what we pay attention to. So if you're in a room full of people, there's going to be certain people who stand out, and some of those people are going to stand out because you really like them, and others may stand out because you really don't like them. And then there's all manner of degrees between really like and really dislike that can influence whether or not we pay attention to someone. So part of the problem is with unconscious bias, well, we're not aware of it because we don't even pay attention to those people who don't get through that first filter. And all amount of self-reflection and contemplation isn't going to inform you about that. But being aware of your social situation, your surroundings, and seeing who actually gets your attention and whether or not that valence is on the positive or the negative side can inform who your biases are oriented toward, both positive and negative. I don't know if that really helps much, but that's the best I can do.
Thank you. That was John Page. He's unable to talk. If you have another question, just type. All right. Thank you, George.
All right. So let's talk about some specific workplace situations where bias tends to rear its ugly head. Can I get somebody to read this screen for us? Anybody want to volunteer? Raise your hand.
All right. Well, he took his hand down.
Oh,
Can
I
we get
did it.
somebody? Can we get somebody? You want me to read it? I can't see it. George, I don't think we can see your screen.
Oh. Well,
All I
that's
see is you're on your phone. You're gone from my presenters list. You're not
good. Oh
even on my.
no.
I don't know what happened to your connection.
Okay. Well, I can't get out of this screen for some reason. This is really weird.
I know.
Well, let me
Technology
just
is
read
not
it to
all the
you
way.
then, and we'll wing it. So this is a bias that involves women in everyday interactions. So a colleague says they're glad to see so many women in leadership position at your company, when in reality only 2 out of 15 senior leaders are women. So why does that matter? Well, if people think that women are well represented in leadership when in reality they're not, they're much less likely to do anything to address the problem. They just simply don't see it. That's kind of that unconscious bias I was talking about before. So that's a loss for the company. When companies have more women in leadership, they tend to have more employee-friendly policies and procedures, and they get better business results. So what can you do about that? Well, one of the things is point out the numbers which speak for themselves, and just be direct and say, it's great that we've got those 2 women on the leadership team, but they're only 2 out of 15. And women are half the population, so women are still really underrepresented in leadership positions in this company. And you can also share the research results that show having more women in leadership positions can be good for a company's bottom line. And so if you look at the org chart in your company and they have names on them, think about how many of those individuals actually are non-whites, and how many of them, in addition, are male versus female. So why does this happen? Well, when it comes down to women in leadership, women tend to be too satisfied with the status quo. So 45% of men and 28% of women think women are well represented when only 1 in senior leaders at their company is a woman. So we've got really low expectations, and these are really the result of generations of inequality. When there used to be no women senior leaders, seeing just 1 or 2 can really feel like a huge step forward. And it's hard to imagine a groundswell for change when we don't have higher expectations for what equality looks like, because we think, well, 2 is better than none, but in fact, it is not representative of the general population data. So a different scenario, and this is particularly with regards to workplace hiring processes and procedures. So have you ever been in a situation where after an interview, a colleague says that they didn't like how that woman candidate bragged about her strengths and her accomplishments? Well, why this matters in general, candidates who are well liked are more likely to be hired. That's kind of a no-brainer. So when women are seen as less likable, they are often less likely to get the job. And companies that fail to hire talented women miss out on a huge potential pool of talent, and it necessarily will impact the quality of the work that happens in the company as well as the outcomes. So what can you do about that? Well, first of all, you could ask your colleagues to explore their thinking. Say something like, well, that's interesting. Do you think you'd have that same reaction if a man bragged and was really talking up their strengths? And you then follow that up by saying something like, I just thought she was talking confidently about her talents. It also would be appropriate to point out that in a job interview, you're kind of expected to talk about your strengths. So what's the deal with penalizing women who do that, but making that sort of the expectation for men? So let me pause right here and see if anyone else has ideas about what would be appropriate to be done in this scenario with women who express strengths being looked at as a threat or a challenge. Anybody got any suggestions or ideas?
All right. Well, Miranda Towns, you are unmuted. You have your
Hey, Miranda.
I would take a survey to get a general idea about what would it take, or I'm sorry, I would try to take a survey to get an idea about how people in that company are perceived. Does that make any sense?
It does.
I would say, for instance, if you wanted the position, what would be your biggest strength? And I would sort of try to pull out the strength versus rather the gender of a color.
Yes.
And I will hold people, sort of like hold people accountable. Well, Michelle fits that position. Well, I don't want Michelle. Why don't you want Michelle? You said you wanted someone who was competent, someone that was leadership, somebody that gets along well with others, somebody that's respectable. That's her.
Yes. And where does this actually fit in with the difference in how you judge a female candidate versus a male candidate for the job?
It will make people aware that they may want to go back and rethink how they're looking at the person who may be suitable for the position or unsuitable. Because sometimes we have to challenge how people think. We have to challenge why they think the way they think, because the thinking is what produces the behavior.
Okay. Well, and there's emotional components to that as well. And part of what gets triggered in men who see assertive women, and I'm not saying aggressive, I'm saying assertive, is almost, not almost, but it's a threat. It's the male dominance becomes challenged. And one way to react to that, since you can't beat her up and show you're actually the alpha, is to say, to belittle and to put down and to discount. So that's kind of why this happens.
And you know what? Sometimes that happens among women themselves.
Oh, absolutely.
Because I'm sort of like, I'm aggressive. And I've had a lot of women just tell me that I think I'm all that in a bag of chips.
There you go.
I'm just a college student. And they be like, oh, you think you know everything just because you go to college. And I'm like, no, I don't. So sometimes it's not coming from men. Sometimes it's women with women.
Sure. And so within the female gender, that same sort of jockeying for position happens.
Mm-hmm.
And underlying this is what's called the likability bias.
Mm-hmm.
So we expect men to be assertive. We expect women to not be assertive. And in fact, we will have a negative reaction when women do the same sort of assertive behavior as men. And that puts women candidates in a much more difficult spot, or women employees in a difficult spot. If they tout their achievements, it can hurt their chances of being hired or being considered for a promotion. But if they don't, their achievements are often overlooked. So it's sort of a catch-22.
Christina Alexander has her hand raised. You are unmuted. Please unmute
Hey,
yourself.
Kristen.
Christina, you are self-muted. Please unmute yourself.
I got it. Did I get it?
Excellent.
Well, I was just going to point out that there's a way to deal with that I don't particularly like, because I think it kind of mollycoddles people who are acting out of fear of their biases, even if it's subconsciously. But you can point out the ways that that person's strengths and projects that they've done are going to complement the work of the person who seems so threatened. It's not my favorite, because I think it doesn't address underlyingly, but in the moment, if you're trying to advocate for someone and you need to do it in front of all the people who are in the room at that interview, then it can work well.
So in that context, there would be support for standing up for the candidate who is simply describing their accomplishments. And so you might not feel as much inhibition to do that.
Well, absolutely. And I think that that's a conversation that sometimes happens after the interview has been completed.
Okay.
To point out if someone says, I don't like them, they were doing this, or I found them assertive, well, the fact that they have such wonderful experience in preparing reports through Excel will really complement all of the work you've been doing on the databases and help you make a better impression the next time we need to present to the board.
Yeah. Nice.
However, that does still leave the fact that that's going to need to be circled back to and addressed if that becomes a chronic issue with whoever it is in that interview, especially if there's someone in a position to be in the interview and making decisions.
Yeah. And so you find yourself being more able to support other women in that context.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good. So it really is about that social support. So sometimes and the challenge is being the first one to speak up, if that makes sense.
All right. We have Ben Young. You are unmuted, Mr. Young.
I think the first thing you said, George, was what can we do? And I think having been made aware that it even exists in our workplace, someone needs to be a little more making our other counterparts aware, so that the conversation at least starts to be held that maybe we are missing a valuable opportunity. Because I noticed we've talked about subtle, deliberate, and unconscious. So after we are made aware of this information, someone has to take the initiative in our particular working environment and start the conversation. I think that would be a beginning.
Nice. And as a result of participating in this webinar, hopefully it'll ding in your mind that, oh, here's an opportunity. Thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you, Ben. All right, that's it for the hands raised. No more hands raised right now.
Well, good. And I apologize. I don't know why I can't project my screen, but we'll just keep going. And I appreciate your patience with not being able to see.
Let's see. Let me change. Wait a minute. You might be able to do it. You may be able to do it now. Hold on one second. Let's try it again.
There we go.
There you go.
But I can't get back to the PowerPoint.
Oh, okay.
There we go. There we go. Just about have too much going on. So, let's see, here we are. Let's see if this works. Can you see my screen now? Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can see it. I can see it.
Excellent.
They're saying yes.
Wow. miracles never cease to amaze me. So here's the next meeting dynamic. So, and again, this is about being in a meeting. There's males and females in the room. So in a meeting, a woman strongly disagrees with a man about how to approach a problem. He says, we can't talk about this anymore. She's getting way too emotional. So why this matters? Well, in a healthy workplace, debates happen all the time and often result in better ideas and clearer strategies and stronger and more cohesive teams as a result of debate. But shutting down the debate is really counterproductive and impedes progress toward the company's goals. So being tagged as overly emotional diminishes the woman's standing and sends a message to everybody else in the room that it's really not okay to speak freely. So what can you do? See if anybody be interested in volunteering to read this slide for us.
All right.
You are, raise your hand.
Not yet. I don't have any. Want me to do it?
Sure, go ahead.
All right. What you want to, what to do? Speak up. You can say something to support the woman's point of view. I think their name Sheila is making a good point. We should consider it. You could also push back on the too emotional comment directly. She doesn't seem too emotional to me. Let's keep talking. Or you can just help your team get back to basics. We're all just trying to come up with the best approach. Let's continue this conversation so we can land on the right solution together.
Nice. So again, it's being the voice that says, that appreciate your opinion. Here's a different way of looking at it. So why does this happen? Again, it's about being stereotyped as the emotional gender. While men tend to be viewed as the rational or cognitive part of the gender. And understand that that is an absolutely false dichotomy. Men and women are built with both the emotional and the rational components built into our physiology. It's in our brains. So falling back on that bias can lead people to see women with an opinion, especially if she expresses it with conviction, as really being overly emotional, while the same view voiced by a man is considered to be good thinking. And so how we counteract that bias that says, oh, women are just a bunch of emotions and men are just the rational people, we have to be able to stand up and say, this is a way of looking at a situation, and it's not about whether or not they're too emotional. Would you say the same thing about somebody who says that's too rational? Probably not. So let's try this one. You're in a meeting and a woman suggests an idea that falls flat. And then a few minutes later, a man suggests the same idea, but gets an enthusiastic reaction. So obviously getting credit for ideas is important, and often how employees get noticed. So when people don't feel heard, they may stop speaking up, and therefore basically their contributions get stuffed. And over time, it basically slows down that person's advancement, if advancement occurs at all. So in both cases, companies end up really missing out on the inherent talent that's available and in the room. Can we get somebody to read this slide?
I have Miranda Town. She had a question. So
Hey,
Susan
Miranda.
Morley. I'm sorry, Susan Morley. Go ahead, Susan.
Hi. Yeah, so I'm going to backtrack just a second and then I'm going to try. So I really appreciate the responses earlier because it's not calling out and there's no shaming. There's no teaching a lesson. I'm doing air quotes. It's just simply elevating the conversation in a very mature, reasonable way. And I need practice in that, so I appreciate that modeling. Also, and then on this one, the only thing I can think of is like, I can just hear myself if my idea was taken, I guess, or amplified by a male and then nobody acknowledged I was doing it. I would either just stew and be quiet, or like, I'm sure my voice would get really high pitched and then I would seem hysterical. So I am interested to hear, what other people think, but the way that the what to do part, I immediately calm down. You know what I mean? Like, just, if somebody were to say, man or woman, oh, that kind of sounds familiar. I think that's what so-and-so was saying. I mean, that's it. I just love how simple the responses can be. Thank you.
Yes. And it's that acknowledgement that allows that calmness to suddenly overcome the anxiety that you feel because your idea was either discounted or ignored. Very good.
Thank you. Are you gonna, did you read the question or you still need somebody to do that?
No, she got to this. Yeah.
Okay.
So
you want to read this? Go ahead.
All right. So what to do? You can remind everyone that the idea originated with your woman colleague. Quote, I think Susan made that point a few moments ago. I like this direction, end quote. Advocating for women coworkers in this way can help them get noticed for their contributions, and it can also position you as a leader.
Nice. And I think that last statement, that last phrase is really important. So as we step up and voice this opinion and address the bias, we will begin to notice that there are allies that will get behind us or get next to us in this line. And if you're one of the first, obviously you may actually start a revolution by people knowing that you're somebody who will stand up for people who on the most extreme end are oppressed, on the less extreme end get overlooked because of bias. So why does this happen? Again, because we tend to underestimate women's performance and overestimate men's. And as a result, we don't give women as much credit for their ideas. And this really does show up a lot in meetings. The team doesn't hear a woman's idea, but if the man says the same thing, suddenly everybody pays attention to it. And this is rooted in attribution bias.
Wow, you got another hand raised. Al Cotton, you are.
Hey, Al.
Hey, George, how are you?
I'm good.
Welcome
back to Atlanta.
Oh, I was in Atlanta earlier this week, but I just started my job in Birmingham. I'm real excited to be up here at UAB.
Excellent.
So this issue we're talking about is really an issue of generosity, because if you think you're in a zero-sum game at work, it becomes that much harder for you to try to throw credit to someone else. But if you are really able to be generous and to be able to not have to feel you need the credit yourself, that's how you can really get to be an ally for other people.
So Al, how did you get to the place of having that realization that ultimately it is about generosity?
Well, it's one of the things that I've been studying in Buddhism lately, about how we try to hold on to things, even though we are not, there's really not much to hold on to. And I found in almost all the stuff I've been doing that if I don't need the credit, I just as soon not have it. I'd rather give it to somebody else myself.
Well, kind of the other side of that credit card is the blame. So to some extent,
that's the mirror opposite reaction that terrifies people. So I want the credit, but I don't want the blame.
Yeah, exactly.
And what we're haggling about, really, in the grand scheme of life, doesn't necessarily mean it's an important physical thing. It's not really necessarily adding. If I don't get credit, it doesn't mean my value and worth is diminished, as opposed to when I do get credit, somehow I suddenly I have more riches than I had before. Well, not necessarily.
Yeah. It's interesting to think that if you're in a good workplace, you might need to stand up. But if you're not in a good workplace, it can be really hard to stand up.
Absolutely. Okay.
All right. Thank
Let's
you.
talk specifically about a situation involving reviews and promotions. So everybody who's got a job at some point, I hope your manager does a performance review, and the scores on those reviews have a direct implication for being considered for raises and or promotions. So you're on a review committee, and several members argue against a woman's promotion because she is not seen as a leader, even though her team delivers outstanding results. So why this matter is that the review committee is making incorrect and, in this case, unfair assumptions about the woman's abilities. Additionally, if the review committee uses a narrow definition of leadership, they may unfairly exclude a lot of talent, and including this particular individual. So can we get a volunteer to read what to do?
George, I have Ben. He has his hand raised, so hopefully he can do both.
Okay.
You are unmuted.
What to do? Point out that the women's team delivers superb results and suggest that their performance speaks to her leadership. You can also ask them to explain the attributes she lacks. When people are asked to justify their thinking, it can help reduce bias in decision making. As a long-term solution, suggest creating detailed metrics for performance review, including clear expectations for leaders. This way, all employees will be evaluated based on a more complete definition of good leadership and using the same standards, which reduce bias in the review process.
Good. So pick out of that what makes most sense to you. What stands out?
Giving a clear path so that there is some real equity in the use of the power, because that's what it boils down to, the power struggle. So this particular formula actually gives some teeth to the equation of selection versus gender versus nepotism or whatever you've been using. This, or at least it speaks to a more equitable form. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
and everybody will be going in. Go ahead, George. I'm sorry.
Everybody is evaluated on the same metrics, and that's a hard thing to kind of get across, because in those performance evaluations, usually the same criteria are used, but if the manager doesn't look across all of the employees that they're evaluating to see whether or not there's a bias with regards to gender or race or sexual orientation, those other areas, it may not be obvious that they're giving different marks on each of the metrics, not really based on performance, but based on a bias.
And
And
it
so,
happens a lot of times unconsciously.
absolutely. And that's the role of the manager's supervisor. So, as part of the evaluation process, it's a multi-tiered function. So, I evaluate the employees that I'm responsible for supervising, and then I have an evaluator that should use the same metric to evaluate me that that individual uses to assess other managers. And the key part of that review process is to say, are you actually basing your ratings on job performance, or is there something else? And really the only way to do that is to look across the pool of data and sort it out by gender and by other socio-demographic variables to see if the numbers suggest there is some bias at work there. And by the way, I suggest that same process impacts how we interact with our peers. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hold on. I had muted him there. Ben,
Oh, okay.
you had another comment?
I agree, George. I agree, George, because based on this particular conversation we've been holding in this webinar, a lot of times they've just been doing this particular process one way for so long, they don't even consider it might even be something wrong with it. It becomes the norm, and consequently, good clients suffer, particularly based on this topic. The women in the process are the
Yes. So on your peer caseload, who are the people who are making progress and who are not? And having some objective metric to help make that discernment is an important part of the process. Who are the folks that aren't doing well on your caseload? And how do you attend to the challenges that are faced with providing something different so that progress does begin to get made? And I don't want to get off on this tangent, but that's the whole point of PCOMs and getting the person's opinion about what their life has been like in the last week at multiple points during the service delivery process. Because ultimately, that's the metric that will inform whether or not the individual is making progress. It's not based on your bias. So if somebody's on a different recovery pathway than yours, the natural bias, the affinity bias, would basically say those people you view as making better progress, even though in their view they may not, than others who are on a different pathway.
And earlier today, we had a staff meeting, and in the staff meeting, our director made a statement that reflects what we are discussing. Irregardless, everyone is supposed to be viewed similarly with no bias. It basically what the conversation was about.
Well, let me just throw this out. If you've got a peer that is in recovery and they are using methadone, are they provided the same level of support and encouragement and compassion as somebody who is doing 90 and 90 and who is
how the conversation got
trying
started.
to be abstinent? That's the challenge.
That's actually how the conversation got started in the staff meeting, addressing each client on the same basis.
Yeah, and it's from that peer's point of view that matters most.
Right.
So in this particular review and promotion scenario, both men and women are more readily associate men with leadership. And this bias is so strong that when women work on teams, their contributions are often overlooked and attributed to the team as a whole. Whereas when men work on teams, they're more likely to be singled out as effective leaders, doing the exact same thing that women would do and get overlooked. And this is again rooted in performance bias and attribution bias. So let's move into another workplace scenario, a different domain related to who we mentor and who we sponsor. So you make the decision to mentor somebody because they remind you of you back then. And I hear this a lot in recovery peer services. Oh, I like working with that person because they remind me of myself back when I first got into recovery. Well, why this matters is because good mentors certainly play a big role in helping support people's progress in recovery and on the job. And employees with mentors are more likely to get raises and promotions. But because managers and senior leaders are more likely to be white men, and because people tend to gravitate toward mentoring others like themselves, women and people of color often miss out on that mentoring support. So that also means your company could miss out on fostering talented employees. So what could we do about that? Do we have a volunteer who might be willing to read this one?
Let's see. Can someone raise their hand, please? Read this for us. All right, I got Catherine Hampton Staples. You are unmuted. You're self-muted. Unmute yourself, Kat.
Hey, Kat.
All right.
Well,
we
I
got.
think in the interest of time, I'll just run through this one.
Okay. Thank you.
So
Anyway.
be aware of this dynamic and let it inform your choices. If you're a white man, you're more likely to be in a position of authority someday. So you can make the workplace fairer by being more thoughtful about whom you mentor. Consider proactively reaching out to mentor someone of a different background. If you're a woman or a person of color, you might decide to mentor somebody like yourself, especially if you remember struggling to find mentors when you were coming up through the ranks. And in case you're mentoring people like yourself, support diversity and inclusion. So this is one of those affinity bias caused effects. We tend to prefer to hang out with people that are like us. Birds of a feather flock together. And this can lead us to invest more in people who remind us of ourselves, perhaps because we assume these relationships will feel more comfortable for us. So I want to zip on down here to the closing activity. And what I want you to do is to literally finish this sentence. Get out a pencil and a piece of paper. My one action to address gender bias in the workplace is. What do you think you could start doing tomorrow, since today is hopefully over for you, unless you're working second or third shift? What could you do tomorrow to begin to address gender bias in your workplace? When you've got that written down, if you'd like to share your answer with us, if you would please raise your hand, that'd be really helpful. Anybody?
All right, Susan Morley.
Hey, Susan.
Hi. So I work for myself, but I'm pledged to notice the affinity bias. Just notice.
Nice.
That's what I'm going to do.
Okay.
Thank you. I got a comment from John Page. He says he's going to provide support to his colleagues, which also lifts them up.
Very good, John.
That's it for right now.
Okay.
Anybody else? Oh, let's try Kat. Kat says she agrees about being more aware.
Man,
What,
that really, it kind of all begins with that awareness.
all right. And Benjamin Young, you are unmuted.
I think
Hey, Ben.
I can start tomorrow to constantly encourage the females coworkers that I encounter in my workplace. Encourage them based on the job I see them doing.
Sure.
Okay, I got a comment sent in by Michael Jones. He says he will be more of an advocate in helping to reduce bias at his workplace.
Perfect.
I think that's it for now. Okay.
So recognize that part of what keeps us from doing this, well, let me speak for me. What keeps me from doing this more actively is that there is a potential penalty that you may pay by stepping out and becoming the advocate. However, if in your experience somebody did that for you, this is essentially paying it back. And yes, there may be consequences that are both negative, but there's likely going to be more positives down the road for you. And to kind of go back to Al's frame of reference on this, it's karma. The more good things you do for others, the more likely your experiences will include good things down the road.
Tahila Clemens has a comment. She says she will continue to make activities inclusive to everyone.
Nice.
That's all I have for right now.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you all for being on the webinar. I apologize for the technical difficulties. I hope next time I'm not sitting in a parking lot in Atlanta when I'm doing this. But we will have a third session on this, October the 17th in the morning, beginning at 11:30. There is a website, leanin.org, that has a lot of resources about gender equity and gender bias. And there's information there on how you can start lean in circles at your workplace. And there's an ongoing workplace study that folks are invited to participate in. I do want to mention, and I'm not endorsing any particular presidential candidate, but Lean In has started a Get Out the Bias initiative that specifically talks about ways for us to acknowledge and recognize the bias that will occur as we lead up to the 2020 election, and how that gender bias impacts women candidates and what you can do to challenge that. So if you're interested, go to Lean In and specifically look at that Get Out the Bias section. Any last comments or questions?
We have one hand raised. Let's see. Benjamin, did you have a comment or question before we sign out?
Just wanted to compliment George on the fabulous job that he did, and you also for continuing to put up with us and put these webinars together. Thank both of you guys.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Anybody else? You got 1 minute. Okay. Let's see. Kat says, thanks, George. Great job. And thank Larry. Thank you. Super from John Page. Thank you guys so much. Anything else, George?
I just want to say this would not be possible without Larry's expertise. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Y'all take care.
Thank y'all for attending. Y'all have a great day. If you have any questions or you can't get to the handouts or anything, email me at laree@gasubstanceabuse.org and I'll be happy to get it to you. You have a good evening. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, guys.